I'm not sure I should thank you for asking me to talk on this topic, because I look around the audience and I see primarily a young audience, and I remember when I was young that the history of science was something for boring old people. So I guess Paul and colleagues on the organizing committee think that I'm now one of those boring old people. And they're probably right. But what I'm going to try and talk about is some of the lessons from history that are relevant to what we do today. And of course, I should begin with a disclosure, because over the last 30-odd years, I've worked with many commercial organizations that have an interest in some of the things I'll talk about. They've had some influence in the research I've done, but I don't think they've shaped my opinions on most of these things. And the talk I'm going to give is based on one that I gave last year at the American College of Sports Medicine, the Dill Lecture, named after David Bruce Dill, who of course made an enormous contribution to exercise physiology throughout an extremely long and distinguished career. But what I'm not going to do is to attempt a comprehensive history of the subject, but rather to look at some specific issues. And I'm going to begin with a lesson that we probably all know. How many of you recognize this quotation from George Santayana? I see a few hands go up. Well, if you recognize this quotation, you misrecognize it, because that's not actually what he wrote. He said, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Basically the same, but not quite the same. But he plagiarized, as so many people do in science. So plagiarism isn't new. So this was written in 1905, but more than 100 years earlier, Edmund Burke said, "Those who don't know history are destined to repeat it." So the same message recycled after an interval of 100 years. And you can see, as a statesman, he influenced some people in a very powerful way, because this is a statue in Bristol, and you can see the bullet holes in the statue from people who didn't like some of the things he said about Anglo-Irish relationships. And one of the things I've noticed over the last couple of days at this conference is there have been a number of recurring themes that have cropped up in many of the presentations. And these are common to most of what we do in our research and teaching careers. We talk about evidence-based practice. And the theme of personalized medicine has become very common in the last few years. And several people talked about responders and non-responders, although I noted this morning that Kirsten Wunby was somewhat dubious about whether the people identified in this way really were in that either of those categories. We talk about the individualization of advice rather than giving generic advice, and we talk about periodization of training to achieve the maximum benefit, and therefore periodization of nutrient intake in order to support that training. And these are portrayed as somewhat new developments. And one of the things I'll try to say is that for many of these things, they're not particularly new. And to support that, I'll begin with a copy of an opening page of a text published in 1914. And the title is Mental Work and Fatigue and Individual Differences and Their Causes. So already 100 years ago, it was recognized that people were different, and there was an attempt to understand why people responded differently in the same situation. And a quote too from round about the same time, a little bit earlier, from Benedict's lab. And they said, in order not to place too much weight upon results which might be due to the idiosyncrasies of a single individual, and also to find out if any such idiosyncrasies existed, a number of subjects were included in the study. So they're looking at that individualization of response, i.e. responders and non-responders, do they exist? And they're trying to deal with a population composed of a number of diverse individuals. But to go back to the early days of exercise, nutrition, and metabolism, I'll introduce this subject, Captain Barclay Allardyce, one of the greatest athletes of all time. He may not look like it, but he was. He made many outstanding achievements, both in athletics, or pedestrianism as it was known at the time, and in boxing. But his single best-known achievement was the walking of 1,000 miles in 1,000 hours. And that's not terribly difficult. It's only 24 miles a day. for 40 days. And we've got an overweight comedian currently doing something like that, running 27 marathons in 27 days. So this is not very different. But the real challenge, he had to cover 1 mile in each successive hour, which means he never got much of a rest for 40 days and 40 nights. And that becomes extremely challenging. The first 3 times he attempted it, he failed, but in the 4th attempt, he succeeded. And it's a pretty impressive performance, as indeed were many of his other achievements in long-distance walking. And if you read what he did in terms of training and diet, it's quite remarkable. This is what he had to say about diet. The diet is very simple. Animal diet is alone prescribed, and beef and mutton are preferred. Everything inducing flatulency must be carefully avoided. So he got some things right. Vegetables, he said, such as carrots or potatoes, are never given, watery, of difficult digestion. Fish must be avoided, not nutritious. No butter, no cheese, no eggs. So it's a pretty restricted diet. And if you look at his training, key issues in training, it was certainly periodized, because after a competition he would rest and then he'd begin to prepare for the next one. Key elements in the preparation were sweating, using sweating liquors to promote sweating, heat exposure, wearing of heavy blankets in training, high meat diet, and of course purging by the taking of various purgatives. And these were the main elements of his preparation. And in spite of that, he achieved some phenomenal performances. But people looking at it said he achieved those performances because of it. And his ideas on training and diet persisted for many, many years. And indeed, you can still see some of them in existence today. So move forward a few years, and this is a standard textbook of athletics and football published by Montagu Shearman, who was very heavily involved in the early days of athletics and football. And see what he had to say about training and diet. And he said sweating, meat eating, and purging constituted the old system of training. It was chiefly applied to men of the lower classes, used to coarse food, and with no highly organized nervous system. Clearly, he's speaking about football players and not athletes. And of course, this was the day of the amateur, and he said such a method could not be beneficial to an amateur who takes up athletic sports as a recreation and not as a business. And we might think, well, that's a very dated view, isn't it? This guy's clearly out of touch with reality. But if you read some of the other things he had to say, he said the ideal diet for a man in active training is that which would be best for a healthy man who's obliged to take a very large amount of active exercise. And I think we'd by and large agree with that. A varied diet eaten in adequate amounts, by and large, is sufficient. But he went on to say what that diet is a matter for scientists to decide or to differ upon, as they usually do in such matters. So contentious issues in the area of nutrition and exercise are by no means a new phenomenon. And if you look today, almost every day in the popular media, we see some area being highlighted as an area of controversy. So the advice that was given before is now brought into disrepute. Should we eat butter? Should we not eat butter? Is saturated fat as bad for it as we were told a few years ago? And we see popular books promoting one strategy or another strategy, and we've seen some references to these diets over the last few days. And this is from a website promoting the benefits of ketosis, telling me there are many benefits, including weight loss and inch loss, so that sounds good. It gives me stable blood glucose, whatever that is, but it sounds good. And it's going to improve my hair, nails, and skin, so I could certainly do with that. So these diets, these training strategies, whatever they are, heavily promoted. And it was a wise man who said the whole problem with the world is that fools and fanatics are always so certain of themselves and wiser people so full of doubts. So back to nutrition. And if we look back at the early days of metabolism, it's easy to forget that 100 years ago there was some uncertainty as to the major metabolic pathways by which muscle produced energy. Did it oxidize carbohydrate? Did it oxidize fat? Could it oxidize fat without first converting that fat to carbohydrate? And remember, there was no understanding of intermediary metabolism. It was in essence a black box. Food went in, carbon dioxide and water came out, and energy was produced somewhere in the middle. So the working out of those metabolic pathways took time and involved a number of wrong turnings along the way. One of the earliest papers in this area, published by Krogh and Windhart in 1920, Journal of Biochemical Journal. They certainly wouldn't be able to publish that today, because if you look at the reference, the paper was 73 pages long, and I don't think any journal today would give you 73 pages. But the real central point about this paper was that Krogh realized that the methods that were being used were inappropriate. They were not sufficiently precise for the measurements he wanted to make. And he was a great tinkerer and fiddler with equipment. And of course, he eventually won the Nobel Prize. But he realized if he wanted to study exercise, he needed a model by which a constant or consistent power output could be imposed on a subject. So he built an electrically brake cycle ergometer that allowed a very precise control over the power being imposed on the subject. So he can now study the exercise part of the component, and he can look at responses to different exercise intensities. And that bicycle pretty much became the universal standard. This is Benedict's lab in the US just a couple of years later. And the picture hadn't changed very much when I began my research many years after that. The bicycle was still recognizably the same. The other issues were not hugely different. But Krogh realized too that the methods available for the analysis of expired air, from which he could calculate the respiratory exchange and therefore the substrate oxidation, were not sufficiently precise. So he devised a gas analysis system which was accurate to 0.001%. And a message to young people in the audience: just because this was 100 years ago doesn't mean that some of the methodology was inferior to what is being used today. Some of it undoubtedly was, but I challenge you to find anywhere in the world today someone using a gas analyzer with this level of precision. So these guys could measure exercise intensity very precisely, and they could measure substrate exchange very precisely based on analysis of expired air. And this is Krogh observing the health and safety regulations in place at the time when he's handling pyrogalol, mercury, half-saturated KOH, and so on. No lab coat to be seen anywhere. Those were much freer, much better days. And the gas analysis apparatus he's using, you can still see today in the institute named after him in Copenhagen. And once again, it's not very different from the Haldane analysis that I used when I began working in exercise physiology. Time-consuming, tedious, requiring of a certain mechanical skill, but extremely accurate. And one of the other things I would say too, when a subject left the laboratory, we had half a dozen Douglas bags collected full of air, which we then had to analyze on a Haldane. That would take us an hour or 2 hours sitting in front of the Haldane. One of the things that did was it gave us time to think. And that's one of the things that's perhaps often missing today when the data simply spew out of the automated analyzer. Whether they mean anything or not doesn't really matter. You've got some numbers. If you're sitting in front of a Haldane, you think about what you're doing. But back to the experiment. They had a small number of subjects, and you'll note the investigator self-participation. So the subjects were JL, Johannes Windhart, GL, Goran Lillesvand, who was one of the collaborators, AK, August Krogh, and OH, who was a professional subject. And I'll just blow that up a little bit to make it easier to see. They said the subjects observed distinct differences in the facility or difficulty with which the precise prescribed amount of work was performed. On fat diets, the fatigue became considerable and sometimes excessive. Subjects were generally very tired when on a fat diet, and much less tired or not tired at all when on carbohydrates. So they didn't actually measure performance. They measured substrate oxidation, but they noticed, as you would if you were a subject yourself, that you felt an awful lot better when you'd been eating a high carbohydrate diet for a couple of days than you did when you'd been eating a high fat diet. Now, one of the interesting tables included in that paper is this one, which many of you will recognize. It tells us that when the respiratory exchange ratio is about 0.71, we're getting no energy from carbohydrate, and we're getting all our energy from fat oxidation, neglecting the minor contribution of protein. And as the respiratory quotient, or the respiratory exchange ratio, increases, so the proportion of carbohydrate increases and the proportion of fat decreases, such that when we reach a value of 1, we're oxidizing only carbohydrate and no fat. The part of the table that many people don't look at is this column, which gives us the energy value of 1 liter of oxygen. And you'll see there's a small difference between the oxidation of fat and the oxidation of carbohydrate. When we're oxidizing fat, we get about 4.8 calories for each liter of oxygen. And when we're oxidizing carbohydrate, we get just over 5 calories for each liter of oxygen. A small difference, but I'll try to convince you an important difference. And they say that that table is calculated using the data of Zuntz from 1901. So we have to go back to 1901. Here's the paper of Zuntz, in German, of course. And indeed, it tells us that this is what we get when we oxidize protein, when we oxidize fat, and when we oxidize carbohydrate. We see those differences in the energy made available. The methods, of course, that he used were not as reliable as those available to Krogh and Lindhart, and when you look at the data, there is indeed a lot more noise in the system. Today, we'd probably try to eliminate some of that noise, firstly by using better equipment, but secondly by using much larger numbers of subjects to increase the number of data points. Now, in Zuntz's lab, Frenzel and Reich increased the number of data points, not by increasing the number of subjects, because they had only 2 subjects who were themselves, but they increased the number of repeated measurements. So they had 176 measurements made on these 2 subjects. When they looked at exercise performed on each of them on a fat diet and on a carbohydrate diet, when they ate a fat diet, the respiratory quotient, or the respiratory exchange ratio, was less than it was on the high carbohydrate diet. But interestingly, when they looked at the energy cost of work to do the same amount of work on the high fat diet, needed more energy than on the high carbohydrate diet. And this was consistent for the 2 subjects. And that finding was largely neglected for many, many years. And when we look at the literature over the next 30 or so years, we see an intense debate as to the muscular efficiency on different diets. And much of this can be traced to poor methodology, poor standardization. But eventually, in perhaps the late 1920s, a fairly clear picture did begin to emerge about these findings, and they did confirm those early findings from 1901. And this is from 1928. The net efficiency at a moderate workload, 22% on a normal diet, 23% almost on a high carbohydrate diet, and a bit less than 22% on the high fat diet. So confirming those findings of a change in mechanical efficiency with a change in the diet at 2 different power outputs. So we have a difference in mechanical efficiency, and we have the observation of Krogh and Lindhart that the subjects felt better on high carbohydrate, and we're maybe beginning to see an explanation for that. So the 2 key points at that stage: when fat is used as a fuel, the oxygen cost of work is higher, so we need more oxygen for the same amount of work. And when fat is used as a fuel, more energy is needed for the same amount of external work. And if we go forward a few years yet, this is a paper from Christen and Hansen published in 1939, which you can find on online in English translation thanks to NASA, and I'm not quite sure why NASA provided the translation online of this paper, but they have done, which is very useful. And these guys now looked at performance, and they looked at subjects consuming a normal diet, and their normal diet was 47% carbohydrate, 47% fat in the balanced protein, or a high fat diet, which is extremely high in fat, or an extremely high carbohydrate diet. And the subjects exercised for a fixed time on the normal diet, and they exercised to fatigue on the high fat and high carbohydrate diets. There were 3 subjects, and I'm sorry the graph isn't clearer, but what you can see here is the respiratory exchange ratio for each of the 3 subjects during prolonged exercise on the 3 different dietary conditions. On a high fat diet, the respiratory exchange ratio is low. On the normal diet, it's intermediate. And on the high carbohydrate diet, it begins high and falls progressively. And you can see for each of the subjects, the exercise time to fatigue is much longer on the high carbohydrate diet than it is on the high fat diet. So Bergstrom and Hultman in 1967 were not the first people to show that a high carbohydrate diet would influence exercise performance. It was well known some years before that. And many years after that study, when I embarked on my PhD, I did a very simple study involving 60 minutes of constant cycling on a normal diet, after 3 days on a low carbohydrate diet, and after 3 days on a high fat diet, on a high carbohydrate diet. I saw the expected pattern of change in respiratory exchange ratio. More fat oxidized on the high fat diet, more carbohydrate oxidized on the high carbohydrate diet. And I saw, based on that early work of Frenzel and Reach, the oxygen consumption on the normal diet, it's increased on the high fat diet, and it's decreased on the high carbohydrate diet, as we would predict from those equations. Speaking to my supervisor at the time, Clyde Williams, we were mightily relieved we could produce the results we expected, but because everybody knew this, it's not worth publishing. So we put it down to experience. We can reproduce the results we expect from the literature. And many other people have done that. And this is a study from Dave Kostel's lab in the 1980s, looking at running rather than cycling. When they restricted carbohydrate intake to increase fat oxidation, there was a decrease in running economy, i.e. subjects needed more oxygen to run at the same speed, and an increased perception of fatigue. When they recovered, running economy and perception of effort returned to normal levels. So this was well recognized. Another situation where this might be relevant is in the phenomenon of cardiovascular drift, or cardiac drift, as occurs during prolonged exercise. And this is a paper by Scott Montaigne and Eddie Coyle. And they reported that over the course of a 2-hour exercise period, oxygen uptake increased by about 8% from the 10th minute to the 110th minute. And of course, what's happening over that period of time? The contribution of fat to fuel metabolism is increasing, and the contribution of carbohydrate is decreasing. So the results fit pretty well with the amount of energy that's provided when we oxidize those fuels. The power output is constant. If you increase the proportion of fat being oxidized, you have to increase the oxygen consumption. Well recognized and only worthy of a minor footnote in the paper. So it was surprising a couple of years ago to see a paper highlighting that there's an improved gross efficiency following a short-term high carbohydrate diet published in 2014. And indeed it shows that when we look at gross efficiency, it's higher on a high carbohydrate diet than it is on a normal diet or a high fat diet. These authors didn't, and I hope I'm not offending anyone by saying this, didn't refer to any of the early work where this was clearly established. So knowing history would have allowed them to put this in context somewhat better. But what it did is to reinforce the message that where oxygen supply is limited, there's a definite advantage to using carbohydrate as a fuel. Mechanical efficiency is better. And if we think about some of the implications of that, let's take the example of a marathon, because that's been talked about several times over the last few days, and Mike Joyner referred to the world record for the marathon. This is the world record holder at 2 hours, 2 minutes and 57 seconds. And you can see from his Wikipedia entry, his body mass about 55 kilograms. We know from many studies that the energy cost of running for what I might call a normal individual is about 1 kilocalorie per kilogram per kilometer. But we know that the elite marathon runner is a little bit more efficient. So we can select a value of about 0.9 kilocalories per kilogram per kilometer. So if you weigh 59 kilograms, doesn't matter how fast you run a marathon, you're going to use about 2,089 kilocalories. Now I'd ask you to remember, if you're burning oxygen, if you're burning carbohydrate, you'll get about 5.06 kilocalories for each liter of oxygen you consume. If you're oxidizing fat, you'll get about 4.71 kilocalories for each liter of oxygen. So you can see where this is going when the energy demand is fixed for running the marathon. So if we take up 2,089 calories, that equates to 417 liters of oxygen if we use only carbohydrate as the fuel, but it relates to 445 liters of oxygen if we use only fat. If we assume a time of 2 hours, which is give or take a couple of minutes, what's that? That's an oxygen consumption of about 3.48 liters a minute on the carbohydrate fuel, but about 3.7 liters a minute on fat. For a 55 kilogram runner, that works out about 63 mils per kilogram per minute on carbohydrate, or about 67 on fat. Let's assume a maximum of about 80 mils per kilogram per minute. So you can run your marathon at 79% of maximum oxygen uptake, or you can run at the same speed using a different substrate, but you're going to have to run at 84% of your maximum. Which would you rather run at? Which is going to feel more comfortable? And if you can run at 84% using fat, why not run at 84% using carbohydrate and run a little bit faster? Or we can look at it another way. Our marathon world record, let's assume that he's not using only fat or only carbohydrate. Let's assume he's using about 30% fat, 70% carbohydrate. He's going to get about 4.95 kilocalories for each liter of oxygen he uses. Now, if we can change his diet or change his metabolism so he now uses only 10% fat and 90% carbohydrate, we get a little bit more energy for each liter of oxygen, about 1.6% more energy. And that's worth about 2 minutes over the course of a marathon race. 2 minutes maybe isn't very important if you're a 5-hour marathon runner, but if you're running 2 hours, 2 minutes, it's a pretty important difference. But I hear you say there's not enough carbohydrate, and we've heard repeatedly over the last few days that glycogen depletion, carbohydrate depletion, is the cause of fatigue. Well, it might be in some situations, but it's not in most situations. So again, if we think about our 2,089 kilocalories, that's worth 522 grams of carbohydrate if we use 100% carbohydrate as an energy source. Have we got 522 grams of carbohydrate? Well, if we're rested and we've been eating a high carbohydrate diet, we can probably get 500 grams of carbohydrate in the muscle. We can probably get 100 grams or maybe even a little bit more in the liver. And we know from the recent studies of Asko Yukenrup and his colleagues that we can oxidize at least a gram a minute of exogenous carbohydrate. So over 2 hours, there's another 120 grams. So we should comfortably have enough. But of course, we can't use all of that muscle glycogen, and we possibly also can't use all of that liver glycogen. So is it realistic to suggest that we can have enough carbohydrate? Well, I'll look at a slightly different exercise model, and this is a study carried out by Yanis Pitsaladis. It was a fairly heroic study, at least on the part of the subjects, if not on the part of the investigators. The subjects had to do 4 trials to exhaustion at 70% of VO2 max after a high carbohydrate diet in the cold, or a high carbohydrate diet in the heat, a low carbohydrate diet in the cold or a low carbohydrate diet in the heat. And you can see very different exercise times in these different models. But after the high carbohydrate diet in the cold, they could keep going for about 158 minutes before they became exhausted. Now this is cycling, not running. There's a much smaller muscle mass involved, so the total amount of muscle glycogen available is likely to be much smaller. But nonetheless, if we look at the total amount of carbohydrate oxidized and there was no exogenous carbohydrate ingested during the exercise, these guys could oxidize 434 grams of carbohydrate. So this amount at least was available during 2 and a bit hours of cycling exercise. So it's not unreasonable to suggest that amount should be available during the course of running a marathon. So running out of carbohydrate probably isn't a problem. So I would suggest, in spite of what we've heard about high-fat diets and sparing glycogen and strategies to spare glycogen, the challenge is not to spare it, but to promote its use. If we've got enough carbohydrate, why do we want to spare it? So the challenge is to increase carbohydrate storage and increase carbohydrate utilization, in spite of the disagreement of others. And of course, as I mentioned, you can ingest carbohydrate during exercise, and studies in the 1920s at the Boston Marathon showed carbohydrate ingestion could help people prevent symptoms of hypoglycemia during marathon races. So the fashion came to be to ingest carbohydrate during exercise, to consume fluids during exercise. The carbohydrate story, of course, attracted particular attention during the war, when people had to do hard physical work. This is the First World War I'm referring to, and this is an American publication, Popular Science Monthly, looking at the implications of hard physical exercise for carbohydrate requirements. And they said soldiers under special rations of sugar withstood the hardship of forced marches much better than did those who had none or even a normal amount. So we can trace back the idea that a high carbohydrate diet will benefit performance. This is a publication by the US Bureau of Agriculture promoting the benefits of sugar. So commercial interests in promoting nutrition strategies are not new. They wanted to sell American sugar. But it is interesting because they refer to a number of studies carried out by the German military looking at carbohydrate feeding to soldiers during prolonged walking and the implications for performance of exercise. And they say the sugar was relished and the soldiers performed better. There was no reference, of course, in that publication, and it proved extremely difficult to pursue these studies. Where would you go to pursue this? We're told they followed the work of Schoenberg. So you go to Google, of course, you put in Schoenberg, you put in soldiers, you put in fatigue, but you hit a brick wall because there's a large American military base at Schaumburg in Illinois. So if you ask Google about Schoenberg and soldiers, it says, no, you mean Schaumburg and soldiers, and it directs you to the US Army Recruiting Center in Schaumburg, Illinois. So you tell Google, no, I don't mean Schaumburg, I mean Schoenberg. And it says, I don't believe you, you mean Schaumburg. So it took a bit of effort, and I thank Paolo Colombani for finding these references for me. This is a paper of military training, a military training handbook, published in 1897 by Leitensdorfer. And in it, he says, one should rather not eat too many starchy foods, but focus more on fat. So there seems to be a disjoint here, because the publication was referring to the German military as favoring carbohydrate. But Paolo then found for me a second reference. My German's not very good, so he helped me with the finding and the translation, and this is the German Journal of Military Medicine from the year after that, 1898. And in it he writes, sugar is a temporary strengthening and reinforcing agent for marchers. So within a year, he changed his mind based on the experiments they'd done feeding sugar to soldiers. It improves exercise performance when fed during exercise. I'll switch tack briefly and talk a little bit about fluids. Captain Barclay was totally opposed to the ingestion of fluids, although he did favor homemade beer. And he said, drink only enough to quench the thirst, which some of you will recognize as advice that's being promulgated today. And of course, the reason it's being promulgated today is the recognition that some people drink too much. And this was first highlighted in a paper published by Tim Noakes in Medicine and Science of Sports and Exercise, talking about water intoxication. But I should change that, because this wasn't the first time it was highlighted. This is a paper published in the British Medical Journal in 1928, communicated by J.S. Haldane, and he refers in this paper not to water intoxication, but to water poisoning. Let me just blow that up a little bit. And he said, men working in hot mines suffer from a sensation of thirst, which appears to be in part due to physical drying of the mucous membranes. They are induced to take large quantities of water, so large as to be in excess of the real requirement of the body. The cramp is a form of water poisoning, not water intoxication, but water poisoning, the same thing, I think, of the muscles, brought about by a combination of great loss of chloride by sweating. And they measured chloride because it was easier to measure than sodium at the time, but sodium chloride, it's essentially the same thing in sweat. Excessive drinking of water, and a temporary paralysis of renal excretion. Exactly what's described today in terms of excess fluid intake, large salt loss and replacement with low salt fluids, and the symptom of inappropriate ADH secretion. All that was needed was a sufficient supply of sodium chloride. So the answer was simply to add some salt to the food or to the drinks that were consumed. And this is highly relevant in another context, because there's been a strong interest over many years in sporting circles in exercise-induced muscle cramp. And this is a paper published by Maughan, who's now at the University of Pretoria in South Africa. And he says that scientific evidence in support of the electrolyte depletion and dehydration hypothesis comes mainly from anecdotal clinical observations, case series totaling 18 cases, and one small case control study. I was vaguely aware there had been some large-scale studies carried out in the American steel mills, and again it proved hard to find the information. I'm grateful to the staff at the Youngstown Industrial Heritage Center in Ohio, because there were some large-scale studies carried out by Bruce Dill and his colleagues in the 1930s looking at the problem of muscle cramp in men doing hard physical work in steel mills where the temperature was extremely hot. And they worked in collaboration with the Youngstown Sheet and Tube Company producing steel, extremely hot working conditions, long periods of time, and with the chief medical officer, they persuaded him to add a small amount of salt to the drinking water supplied in the steel mill. They say there were some complaints at first, but by the middle of the summer, the only complaints came from people at the other steel mills who were not supplied with salted water. And when they looked at what was happening, these are records based on the employment records of staff, the medical records. They say a considerable number of new men. Among 12,000 workmen, there were 22 heat cases, 11 with cramps and 11 with exhaustion who required medical treatment. In the early days, they used to see that number in a single day. So I think the evidence that disturbances of fluid and electrolyte balance are associated with cramp is somewhat stronger than some people would have us believe. And there are other records also from coal miners giving very, very similar results. For the last few minutes of my talk, I'd like to switch tack once again. And I think you saw this picture of Paavo Nurmi again, I think in Mike Joyner's talk. Undoubtedly one of the great athletes of all time with 9 Olympic gold medals, and would surely have had more had he not been disqualified for accepting money. And among other things he said, mind is everything, muscles, pieces of rubber. Everything, all that I am because of my mind. And anyone who works with athletes knows that if you speak to an elite athlete, they will tell you the difference between them and normal people is entirely in the mind. I win because of my mind, my will to win. If you speak to mediocre athletes like me, they'll tell you, I'm just as strong mentally as those guys, but I've got the wrong fiber composition, or genetically I haven't got a big enough heart, or my hemoglobin's not high enough, or I don't take drugs. There's nothing wrong with my will. But the elite athlete insists it's a mental thing. So is it indeed a mental thing? And it's perhaps easy to imagine we've been looking in the wrong place when we measure rectal temperature, or we take blood samples, or we take muscle samples, because it is indeed easier to believe that fatigue is occurring in the brain rather than somewhere else. And contrary to what some might tell you, I'm not either of the people in this picture. But that's a long story. And the first serious attempt to understand the mechanisms by which the brain might be involved in fatigue in these situations came from Eric Newsholm, who produced an extremely elegant central fatigue hypothesis looking at the availability of precursors for the neurotransmitter amino acids in the brain, pointing out that serotonin or 5-HT synthesis in the brain is limited by the uptake of tryptophan, which depends on the free tryptophan branched chain amino acid concentration in peripheral blood. So potentially here we have a link between what's happening in the periphery and what's happening in the brain. The evidence from manipulations of tryptophan and branched chain amino acid concentrations in the brain is not entirely convincing. There are some studies that suggest this mechanism might operate. There are other studies which suggest it might not. We were interested in looking at this, and rather than try an indirect manipulation, we tried to directly influence the availability of serotonin within the brain. And we used a drug called paroxetine, which is widely used for the treatment of depression. It inhibits 5-HT uptake from the synaptic cleft, so it essentially acts as a 5-HT agonist. We gave it to some healthy young men, and we saw a significant decrease in the exercise performance. There were no obvious differences in any of the metabolic, cardiovascular, or thermoregulatory effects that we saw. And there's now a fairly compelling body of evidence that we can use a range of drugs that affect serotonin or dopamine, and we can either increase or decrease exercise performance. So the brain does seem to play a major role, and we do seem to be able to manipulate some of these things and alter performance capacity. And that perhaps has given rise to this idea of a central governor, which has proposed this a process rather than a physical entity in the brain that regulates exercise so that we don't overstretch ourselves, we don't threaten homeostasis, we avoid severe hypoxia, we avoid damage to crucial tissues. And if we look at Wikipedia, that infallible source of information, it tells us that the existence of a central governor was proposed by Tim Noakes in 1997, but a similar idea was suggested in 1924 by Archibald Hill. And we're told that Noakes created the idea of a central governor in the context of prolonged endurance running and proposed that pace is regulated to prevent catastrophic failure. Well, again, if we read some of the older literature, this is from a textbook of muscular physiology published in 1889 by Ferdinand Lagrange. At least the English translation was published in 1889. The French edition was published in 1885. And he said fatigue is a kind of regulator, well, regulator of governor, it's the same thing, isn't it? Warning us we're exceeding the limits of useful exercise and work will soon become dangerous. So the idea of a central regulator or governor is not a new one. And Lagrange also wrote that numerous physiological phenomena show us that the sensation of fatigue has its seat rather in the nerve centers, i.e. the brain, than in the muscles. So the idea that fatigue was central rather than peripheral is also not a particularly new idea. And this is a quote from Francis Bainbridge's textbook of exercise physiology, published in 1919, the year before he died. And he said, it's long been recognized, and this was writing in 1919, it's long been recognized the main seat of fatigue is the central nervous system. Mossel long ago stated that nervous fatigue is the preponderating phenomenon, and muscular fatigue is also at bottom an exhaustion of the nervous system. But Bainbridge had some very sharp insights, and if you only, in your careers, I would say to the young people in the audience, if you only ever read one textbook of physiology, read Francis Bainbridge's textbook from 1919. You'll probably learn more than you will from reading the latest edition of the newest textbook. Some might disagree. I see Caroline Gregg disagrees with that statement. Bainbridge had some remarkable insights, and he said there appear to be two types of fatigue. One arising entirely within the central nervous system, the other in which fatigue of the muscles themselves is superadded to that of the nervous system. I think many people would agree that's pretty much the picture that we have today of the causes of fatigue. And Wikipedia again tells us that pace is regulated to prevent catastrophic failure, and that this is a new observation coming within the last few years. Well, again, although Bainbridge died in 1919, his name remained on the standard textbook of exercise physiology that went through many editions, and this is from the 1957 edition. And it says something that every coach and every athlete knows. And I've highlighted a couple of key points in red. By trial over a period of weeks, the brain learns how to control the muscles with the greatest efficiency. And if we think about an example of running a mile, it's only after doing the mile a number of times the man learns the pace he should set out at in order just to complete the distance when his endurance is becoming exhausted. So this is not an innate phenomenon, it's a learned phenomenon based on experience. You run too fast, you get too tired, you don't finish. You don't set off fast enough, you can do a sprint at the finish and it's not very efficient. And we can see that if we watch children running. It doesn't matter what the distance is, whether it's 50 meters or a mile. They set off as fast as they can. There's no concept of pace regulation. There's no central governor telling them, you ain't going to survive for the whole race. So the guy who wins the race, he looks very determined, but he's probably not going to win the race. He's going to fade in the closing stages. And does the central governor really prevent catastrophic failure? Is it effective in doing that? And the answer from the examples of sport is clearly no. This is Dorando Pietri, who might have won the Olympic Games in London in 1908, but was disqualified for receiving help in the closing stages. Jim Peters in Vancouver in 1954. Gabrielle Anderson-Schiess in Los Angeles in 1984. These are fairly catastrophic failures. Even in these, at least in the case of the latter two, experienced athletes, they encounter catastrophic failures. And even today, or at least relatively recently, in the world of elite sport. This is Steve Jones, one of the great marathon runners of the last 20 or 30 years. And look at his marathon record. First marathon in Chicago, finishes first, 2 hours, 8 minutes and 5 seconds. That's pretty good for your first ever marathon. Second marathon in London, finishes first, 2 hours, 8 minutes and 16 seconds. Third marathon in Chicago, finishes first, 2 hours, 7 minutes, 13 seconds. He figured he could run a bit faster than that. So in the European Championships in Stuttgart in 1986, he set off and did the first half of the race in about 62.5 minutes. That was a little bit too fast. And he took about 80 minutes for the second half of the race. That's a failure of the central governor and a fairly catastrophic failure. So to finish, Paul, what I've tried to say is that no matter what area of contemporary exercise physiology we look at, if we look back through the history, we can see some clear pointers, and this is simply a quote from the book of Ecclesiastes. And I would say that I've tried to highlight some of the things that have been rather positive, but if you read some of the literature too, you find some wrong turnings. But at the time, it's extremely difficult to distinguish what's going to be accepted wisdom in the future and what's going to be proved wrong in the future. So what we know tomorrow may not be what we know today, and we therefore should be cautious about everything we know. And finally, just because we have been talking about the real world of sport, we have to put things in context. And this is a man whose career depends on performance. And he said if you can't pass a football, a plate of pasta is not going to make much difference to the result. And he's absolutely right. Thank you very much.